The accusation was read aloud at noon, when every tenant who had come to pay Michaelmas arrears could hear it. Eliza Harrow stood beneath the carved oak gallery of Wycliffe Hall, with her account book still open in her hands. Across the long table, Gideon Vale laid out 6 vouchers bearing her initials and the neat total of £214. For 7 years she had balanced the Wycliffe estate accounts to the farthing. Now the tenants stared at her, as though thrift itself had put on a thief's face. "You alone kept the cash book," Vale said. His black coat and grave voice made him resemble a churchwarden delivering sad news. "The evidence leaves Sir Matthew no choice." Eliza examined the first voucher. The figure had been entered in her hand, but the words authorizing payment had not. Someone had scraped the paper and written over it. She saw the roughened fibers because her father, Amos Pritchard, had taught her to hold doubtful accounts sideways to the light. He had taught her double entry as other fathers taught daughters music, using brass counters and a narrow calculating rule now tucked inside her sleeve. "These were altered," she said. At the end of the table, 19-year-old Thomas Rook lowered his eyes. A smear of fresh ink marked his cuff. Vale followed Eliza's glance. "Mr. Rook copied what his senior instructed," Vale said softly. "If you accuse him, I shall require the magistrate to examine every hand involved." Thomas's widowed mother rented a Wycliffe cottage. A conviction would ruin both of them. Eliza understood the offer hidden inside the threat. Her husband Samuel had been dead 11 months. The cottage provided with her position was the last home in which his boots had stood by the hearth. Vale proposed that she surrender it, waive her unpaid quarter's wages, and accept a property held by his bank against the disputed sum. The abandoned Brackenmere Tidal Baths, 30 miles north on the coast. Its roof had failed, its rates were overdue, and no sane purchaser had bid at auction. "It is more than the property is worth," Vale said, with practiced mercy. Eliza closed the cash book. "Then you lose nothing by giving me the deed." Vale's smile tightened. He had expected tears, not terms. Yet before the tenants he could not withdraw his generosity. By dusk she possessed a folded conveyance, the bathhouse keys, 11 shillings, her clothes, Samuel's rule, and 2 account books she had bought herself. She left Wycliffe without looking back at the cottage windows. The carrier put her down at Brackenmere 3 days later, beneath a sky the color of pewter. The village clung to a crescent harbor between black cliffs. Above the strand stood the baths, a long sandstone building with blind arches, a roof broken open near the eastern end, and iron railings furred red by salt. A tide clock occupied the central gable. Though its glass was cracked and its hands green, it showed the correct 4:15. Mrs. Fenwick, who kept the Anchor Inn, rented Eliza a box room for 6 pence and advised her to abandon the place before winter. "The channels silted after the great storm. Mr. Vale's bank stripped the pumps. 3 owners tried it and none lasted." "Who winds the clock?" Eliza asked. Mrs. Fenwick looked toward the gable. "No one these 16 years. At low tide next morning, Eliza entered through a door swollen in its frame. The reception hall smelled of kelp, plaster, and old soot. Sand had drifted across encaustic tiles. Beyond it lay separate bathing rooms, a boiler house, and 2 stone plunge pools filmed with rainwater. She marked unsafe ceilings with chalk and chose the former linen room as shelter because its roof remained sound. With a borrowed shovel she cleared its grate, stuffed gaps with sacking, and set Samuel's rule on the mantel. In a warped desk she found admission books extending from 1829 to 1855. Most pages recorded fees of 1 shilling for a warm bath and 4 pence for a cold plunge. Yet every quarter, under the name M. Bell, appeared a payment of £2 10s. The entries continued after the baths closed. The last, dated September 1871, was written in a paler ink. Eliza totaled a page twice. Receipts and expenses balanced only if Bell's payment was treated not as admission income, but as wages returned to the establishment. The wording was deliberately false, but the arithmetic was exact. That evening, as the tide withdrew, she heard water moving behind the north wall. The building plans attached to Vale's deed showed solid rock there. Eliza placed her ear to the damp stone. Beneath the sea's retreat came a slower pulse, regular as breath. On the fourth day, an agent arrived from Vale's Newcastle office. Mr. Crozier wore polished boots unsuited to the Strand and offered £25 for the property, twice the value stated in the conveyance. A charitable correction, he called it. Eliza showed him the door. Before leaving, he glanced not at the ruined roof, but at the tide clock. Winter announced itself through practical demands. Eliza sold her mourning brooch for £1 8 shillings, paid a mason 9 shillings to make the linen room chimney safe, and bought tarred canvas to cover the worst roof opening. She could not repair the baths. She could only stop them dying faster. She copied village accounts at night for Mrs. Fenwick and 2 fishermen, earning enough for bread, coal, lamp oil, and the first installment on the rates. 12-year-old Kit Fenwick began carrying water for her. He had a twisted right foot and knew every safe path across the rocks. When Eliza asked about the gable clock, he climbed to its access hatch. Inside, the mechanism was not driven by a weight. A slender shaft descended through the wall. At the lowest tide, a brass float hidden in a stone sump sank with the water and rewound the clock through a ratchet. Beneath the bearing lay a bright drop of oil. "Someone has been here," Kit whispered. Eliza touched the oil. It smelled faintly of whale oil and rosemary. Her father had used rosemary to keep mice from his cabinet, but here it served another purpose, identifying fresh lubricant against the rancid grease around it. They traced wet boot marks to a locked exterior door below the north terrace. Eliza's keys did not fit. That afternoon she visited the parish church and searched burial registers with the vicar's permission. There was no M. Bell in Brackenmere's graves, baptisms, marriages, or census abstracts. There was, however, a Margaret Bell listed as a laundress at the Baths in 1839, and beside her name the rector had later written, "removed." Eliza first assumed the quarterly entries supported Margaret in some distant parish. Then she noticed the entry hand remained unchanged for 26 years. No laundress had written it. The letters were compact and upright, like engineering labels. She began reclaiming the reception room. The work was slow. Limewash brushed away salt, broken panes were boarded, and rotten desk boards became shelves. Mrs. Fenwick sent 2 chairs. Old Joseph Naylor, once an attendant at the baths, brought a brass valve handle he had saved when the machinery was sold. "Miss Bell designed the channels," he said when Eliza showed him the name. "Miss Marion Bell." The proprietor called her his secretary in company, but she could calculate tidehead better than any engineer. After he died, the trustees erased her from the prospectus. "Did she maintain the clock?" Naylor shook his head. "She died before the baths closed. Her sister Margaret remained." The distinction turned the accounts inside out. M. Bell was not a tenant or a customer. It was a continuing obligation disguised as revenue. Eliza compared dates with tide tables borrowed from the harbor office. Each quarterly entry fell within 3 days of a spring tide. Whoever recorded it had inspected something accessible only when the sea withdrew farthest. With Kit holding the lantern, she measured the north corridor. The inside length exceeded the exterior wall by 9 feet, an impossibility unless Vale's plan omitted a recess. Salt patterns showed that one section of wall dried from the bottom upward. Behind it, water still circulated. They waited for the December spring tide. At dawn, the sea pulled beyond the usual rocks, exposing the lower terrace door. Naylor's valve handle fitted the corroded spindle beside it. 3 turns released the lock, not by magic, but by lifting an iron bar through a chain hidden in the wall. Beyond lay a narrow inspection passage. Copper pipes ran along its ceiling. The air was cool and moving. At the far end, they found a chamber no larger than a pantry containing a slate table, rusted gauges, and a cylindrical tide regulator. On the table rested a sealed stoneware jar. Eliza opened it carefully and found oil, rosemary, and a folded maintenance sheet dated only 6 weeks earlier. The signature was Thomas Rook's. He came to Brackenmere 2 nights later, soaked by rain and frightened enough to confess before the fire. Vale had ordered him to copy altered vouchers and threatened his mother when he hesitated. After Eliza accepted the baths, Thomas had been sent quarterly to oil the regulator and report whether the North Passage remained sealed. "Why preserve what he means to hide?" Eliza asked. Mr. Vale said the system must not fail before he acquired the freehold. He has purchased the cliffland above it. He needs the water rights, though I don't know why. Thomas produced a page torn from Vale's private memorandum book, payments to Crozier, legal fees, and a projected sum from the Brackenmere Water Company. It proved motive, but not Eliza's innocence or ownership. "Keep the original hidden," she told him. "Write out what you remember, date it, and give a copy to someone Vale cannot dismiss." Thomas stared at the fire. "Will you expose me?" "You will tell the truth yourself. That is the protection I can offer." By Christmas, Eliza had established a small bookkeeping room in the old reception hall. Fishermen paid pennies for her to reckon shares and debts. Shopkeepers brought invoices. She charged widows nothing for writing claims. The income remained modest, but it kept the rates current. Work, not rumor, brought people through the door. The work also gave her a clearer account of Brackenmere than any surveyor's map. Men who fished the northern rocks remembered when the outfall ran clear. Washerwomen recalled a tap in the bathhouse yard that never froze, though none could agree when it disappeared. Eliza recorded each recollection with the speaker's name and the limit of what he or she had actually witnessed. Village memory was useful, her father had said, but only if sentiment was kept in a separate column from fact. One client, Agnes Sayer, brought a fish merchant's bill that charged her late husband for 6 barrels of drinking water delivered after his burial. The mistake was ordinary greed, not part of Marion Bell's mystery, yet correcting it mattered. Eliza wrote to the merchant, cited the burial entry, and deducted the charge from Agnes's balance. When he threatened court, 3 boat owners moved their business. The merchant yielded. It was the first dispute Eliza won after Wycliffe, and the victory steadied her more than its value of 12 shillings. Kit watched her rule columns in red and black. He could read slowly, but had never learned decimals. Eliza began teaching him after dusk, using shells for pence and smooth stones for shillings. His quickness lay not in calculation, but in pattern. He noticed that the bell entries sometimes carried a small dot below the final letter, and sometimes a dash. Eliza had dismissed the marks as blots. Under a magnifying lens borrowed from the watchmaker, they proved deliberate. Dots corresponded with purchases of charcoal and copper gauze. Dashes appeared beside payments to masons and pipe fitters. On 4 dates both symbols occurred, and those dates matched extraordinary low tides in the harbormaster's old almanacs. 2 inspections, Kit said. 1 for water and 1 for stone. The marks guided them to the terrace paving. Dot-marked quarters corresponded to a circular iron cover concealed beneath sand. When Naylor helped lift it, they found a filter bed filled in layers: coarse shore gravel, washed river sand, charcoal, and copper mesh. It had not purified the spring itself. It screened seawater used to power the mechanism, preventing weed and shell from choking the float chamber. Marion's notes had been reduced to accounts because accounts were less likely than an engineering claim by a woman to be challenged or destroyed. Eliza made a costly mistake there. Convinced the upper layer was clogged, she paid 2 laborers to remove it before measuring its depth. The filter drained too quickly, drawing silt into a pipe and stopping the tide clock. For 3 days the hands remained fixed at 9:20. Naylor did not spare her feelings. Miss Bell laid those grades for a reason. Eliza wanted to answer that no plan survived, but the truth was simpler. She had acted from impatience. Together they washed and replaced the gravel by size, using a sieve borrowed from the maltster. The work consumed 5 days and 6 shillings. When the clock moved again, Eliza entered the loss in her public account under her own name. That admission changed old Naylor's manner. He brought her a tobacco tin containing screws and 2 folded scraps he had kept since boyhood. One was a printed opening notice from 1834 naming the proprietor and trustees. The other was a pencil sketch of the northern cliff with a line marked "Fresh Ascent." Marian's name did not appear, but the drawing hand matched the maintenance sheet. "Why keep these?" Eliza asked. Naylor rubbed his thumb across the tin lid. "My father called her meddlesome. Then cholera came to the next village and not ours. I began to wonder which of them understood the place." Eliza did not tell him that cholera alone proved nothing. She placed the sketch in a dry portfolio and noted its source. Evidence deserved neither worship nor contempt. The first snow exposed another anomaly. It melted in a narrow line from the spring seep toward the baths, while the surrounding field remained white. A buried conduit carried water warmer than the winter air. Vale's new boundary stakes cut directly across it. Eliza measured the line using twine, a carpenter's square, and distances paced 3 times. Her skill was not surveying, but accounts had taught her to distrust a single measurement. The conduit entered the property 4 feet south of the boundary shown on Vale's copy and 6 feet north of an older parish fence line. Somewhere, a plan had been altered. The village constable would not investigate a line in snow. The parish overseer, however, allowed her to inspect the rate books. Brackenmere Baths had once been assessed with spring house, cistern, and access strip. Those words disappeared in 1856, the year Vale and Company took control of the insolvent operating company. No sale of the strip appeared in parish minutes. Eliza copied the entry before a later hand could improve it. She asked the vicar and overseer to sign beneath her copy, confirming only that it was accurate. Each small precaution arose from Wycliffe. She no longer believed one honest book sufficient when a dishonest man controlled the cupboard. The hidden chamber raised more questions. Marian Bell's regulator used the outgoing tide to draw seawater through a gravel bed, while a separate pipe descended from the cliff. Eliza could follow accounts more readily than pipes, yet the surviving maintenance expenses formed a map. Purchases of charcoal, sand, copper gauze, and lime recurred in quantities too large for bathing alone. A missing tenant existed only because the system had been treated as a person in the books. Credited with fees, charged with repairs, and protected from trustees who would have sold its components. One foggy morning, Kit showed Eliza a seep above the terrace where clear water emerged among ferns. Children drank from harbor barrels fouled by runoff. Fever visited the lower cottages every summer. Marian's system appeared to combine spring water with tidal power, though Eliza could not yet prove where it led. Vale escalated with courtesy. He sent notice that the conveyance excluded subterranean appurtenances beyond the northern foundation. His surveyor placed stakes across the terrace. Then anonymous broadsides appeared calling Eliza a convicted thief, though no court had tried her. She answered with accounts. In the Anchor Inn she displayed a plain weekly statement of every shilling received and spent at the baths, witnessed by Mrs. Fenwick and Naylor. Villagers who distrusted her could inspect the figures. Skeptics remained, but the fishermen whose shares she had corrected tore down the broadsides. In January, a child named Annie Sayer collapsed outside the fish sheds with a fever. The doctor ordered boiled water, but her mother had neither coal nor clean supply. Eliza opened the old boiler room, used the last of her reserve to buy coal, and organized women to boil spring water carried from above the village. She delayed purchasing roof timber and lost a week of paid copying, but Annie recovered. The act revealed the bath's possible future. It also revealed Eliza's weakness. She had believed perfect records could protect her from power. Vale did not need to disprove her arithmetic if he could make the building uninhabitable. On the night of January 28th, someone opened the seaward sluice at high tide. Water rushed into the inspection passage, burst a weakened joint, and flooded the reception room to Eliza's knees. Kit, who had stayed late sorting invoices, was trapped on the desk as tiles lifted beneath him. Eliza waded through freezing water, closed the internal valve with Naylor's handle, and carried the boy to the stairs. A falling board cut her shoulder. Her account books floated open in the black water. By morning, ink had bled across months of work. The linen room remained dry, but the bookkeeping office was ruined. Vale's surveyor arrived before the constable and declared the building dangerous. A notice of injunction forbade Eliza from operating a public establishment pending a boundary hearing. For the first time, she considered selling. Her shoulder throbbed. Her money was nearly gone. Kit's mother blamed herself for letting him help. Samuel's calculating rule lay tarnished on the wet mantle. Eliza had saved the boy, but could not save numbers dissolved into blue clouds. The flood left a brown tide mark across the reception walls and salt crystals on every iron fitting. For 2 nights, Eliza slept sitting up, because lying down pulled the cut in her shoulder. Mrs. Fenwick brought broth and said nothing about the offer to buy. Silence from a practical woman was kinder than encouragement. Kit suffered no injury beyond bruises, but he refused to enter the baths. At the threshold, his face went gray. Eliza did not coax him. She gave him work at the inn, sorting driver seats into years, and crossed the flooded floor alone. Courage, she understood, could not be demanded as payment for rescue. The public ledger was nearly destroyed. She spread its pages over every table in the Anchor, separating them with clean rags. Some villagers assumed their debts had vanished with the ink. Eliza surprised them by refusing to reconstruct doubtful sums against anyone. Where a figure could not be supported by a client's invoice or her duplicate slip, she crossed it out. She lost £1 14 shillings in fees and gained something harder to measure. People began bringing her their own copies without being asked. Agnes Sayer arrived with a basket of papers saved from her husband's sea chest. Among them was a handbill for the baths dated 1848. It advertised warm seawater, private rooms, and pure upland water supplied by the Bell apparatus for drinking and domestic relief. The phrase connected Marion's name to the sanitary system in a document circulated during her life. On the reverse, Agnes's husband had written that his mother collected water there during the dry summer of 1852. Eliza placed the handbill with Naylor's sketch. Neither established title. Together they established public use. When Kit finally returned, he stood outside and asked to see the valve. Eliza showed him how the opened seaward sluice had overwhelmed the weakened joint. Tool marks scarred the spindle. A fragment of dark wool clung beneath the handle. Crozier habitually wore a dark wool greatcoat, but half the county did. Eliza wrapped the fiber and labeled where and when it was found. She would not call suspicion proof. "I should have heard the water sooner," Kit said. "You heard it before I did." "I was sorting your papers, and I was responsible for the building." Eliza crouched so they faced one another. "Blame must follow control, not whoever happens to be smallest in the room." The words were meant for him, but they loosened something in her. At Wycliffe, Vale had arranged the room so responsibility fell upon the least protected people, a widow and a junior clerk. She had accepted ruin to shield Thomas, yet in doing so she had allowed his fear to remain useful to Vale. Mercy without truth had merely postponed the cost. She wrote Thomas a letter requiring him to decide whether he would give a sworn statement. She promised to stand beside him, not to conceal him. Then she wrote Sir Matthew a precise demand for the original vouchers and cash ledgers, noting that refusal would be mentioned at any hearing. Copies went to the magistrate's clerk and a Newcastle solicitor recommended by the vicar. The solicitor, Miss Ada Crew's widowed brother Henry, agreed to advise her for a reduced fee after reading the public account. He warned that a woman could own and administer property, but courts would not reward moral certainty. They needed the conveyance chain, trust instrument, surviving assets, and witnesses capable of establishing custody. "And if the instrument is hidden in the wall," Eliza asked, "then we must prove whose wall, who placed it there, and why it remained untouched." That answer pleased her. It was the legal equivalent of balancing both sides. Thomas arrived with worse news. Vale had discovered the missing memorandum page and dismissed him. His mother had been served notice to leave her cottage. "I brought this before he locked the office," Thomas said. It was a bundle of bank correspondence, but none could be used without admitting theft. Eliza refused it. "We will not answer a forged account with stolen evidence." Thomas flared. "Then he wins because he observes rules only when they bind us." "He wins if truth depends upon what he can call stolen." Her answer sounded stronger than she felt. After he left, she spent hours separating wet pages and pressing them between cloth. At the bottom of the ruined desk, she found a thin brass plate loosened by the flood. It bore a sequence of quarterly figures identical to M. Bell's entries and a stamped instruction: transfer to trust when reserve reaches £200. The account had never recorded a tenant. It had accumulated a reserve. Eliza reconstructed the missing totals from admission books, supplier receipts, and the brass plate. By 1855, the reserve should have reached £203. Yet the closing balance showed £3. £200 had been transferred somewhere else on the exact date Marion Bell's will was proved. The parish chest held no copy of the will, but the diocesan registry at Durham did. Travel cost money Eliza did not have. Mrs. Fenwick placed a jar on the inn counter. Fishermen, washerwomen, and even the skeptical butcher contributed. They were not declaring her innocent. They were paying for an answer about water that might belong to them. Eliza and Thomas traveled by coach through sleet. In the registry, they found Marion Bell's will under her full name: Marion Augusta Bell, spinster and mechanical draftswoman. It left her instruments to Margaret and directed that shares purchased with the Baths Reserve be held for the maintenance in perpetuity of the Brackenmere sanitary water apparatus and the relief of households unable to pay. The appointed trustees were the Bath proprietor, the parish rector, and the senior partner of Vale and Company Bank. The bank had concealed the trust after the other trustees died. But the will did not identify the land boundaries, and the share certificate was absent. Vale could claim the trust had failed for lack of assets. In the margin, Marion referred to the duplicate instrument lodged where my tide answers the hill. Eliza recognized neither poetry nor legal phrase. On the coach home, she drew 2 columns: tide expenses and spring expenses. Her father had taught her that when an account balanced, opposing entries answered each other. The tide regulator must activate something beneath the cliff spring. Back at Brackenmere, the injunction allowed residents but no customers. Eliza, Kit, and Naylor inspected the clear seep. 9 yards downslope, ivy concealed a stone marker cut with a bell and 2 horizontal lines. At the lowest February tide, the regulator's falling float pulled a chain. Far above, a faint click sounded under the marker. They lifted the capstone and found a dry, copper-lined box built into the spring conduit. It contained no treasure. Inside were a rolled engineering plan, the original trust deed, a sealed packet of water company shares, and Marion's brass proportional compass. Waxed linen and the dry flow of spring air had preserved the papers. Margaret Bell's maintenance notes explained why no owner had found them. She alone knew the 2 systems had to be placed at opposite extremes simultaneously. And after her death, the quarterly instructions passed anonymously through the bank. The engineering plan revealed the full legacy. Marion had designed a tide-powered pump that lifted cliff spring water to a covered cistern, then fed standpipes through gravity. The Baths had demonstrated the apparatus. The water company shares were meant to finance its maintenance. Vale had quietly acquired surrounding cliff parcels because a proposed railway hotel would pay dearly for the spring. If the trust remained hidden, he could sell an exclusive supply. Marion's packet also contained 12 letters tied with faded blue thread. They were not love letters or a confession. They were petitions from laborers' wives describing summers when harbor water smelled of drains, children missed school through bowel illness, and families paid carriers more for water than gentlemen paid for a bath. Marion had answered in margins with flow estimates, household numbers, and pipe lengths. Her invention had begun not as an ornament for visitors, but as an answer to those pages. One letter was from Margaret. It described the arrangement by which she would appear in the books as M. Bell, preserving confusion between the sisters. After Marian's death, Margaret maintained the apparatus from a cottage beyond the parish and returned the nominal quarterly payment so the account would continue to balance. She trusted the bank because its founding partner had signed the deed. His son, Gideon Vale's father, inherited the duty but treated it as a burden. When the baths closed, the bank retained the shares, suppressed the trust, and paid Margaret a small sum to keep the mechanism from collapsing until it could acquire every adjoining parcel. Margaret's last note, dated 1861, apologized to the next careful keeper for hiding the duplicate so thoroughly. Twice speculators had stripped metal from the baths. Once a trustee's agent had searched rooms for share certificates. Only the interaction of spring and tide could open the box, and only the accounts explained when to attempt it. Eliza read the letters aloud to Naylor, Mrs. Fenwick, Kit, and Thomas in the inn's private room. She did not read the names of ill children where they were unnecessary. Marian's legacy was evidence, but the villagers' grief was not a spectacle. Naylor wept without covering his face. His younger sister had died during the dry summer of 1829, before the apparatus operated. So she built it for people she wasn't permitted to name in the prospectus. She named them in the trust, Eliza said. The share certificate had a face value of £200. Its market value was higher, and accumulated dividends in the dormant account approached £480. But that money belonged to the trust. Eliza could not use it to mend her private rooms or repay personal losses. Henry Crewe advised asking the court for an emergency allowance solely to prevent further damage to the waterworks. Until then, every repair depended on donations and her remaining wages. They inventoried the discovery in the presence of the vicar, parish overseer, and constable. Each page was numbered. The seals were sketched before anything left the conduit. Mrs. Fenwick signed as the first independent witness to the opening. Kit signed with a careful hand beneath hers. The documents went into the solicitor's strongbox, not Eliza's keeping. Vale would have difficulty claiming that she altered papers she no longer controlled. The water system itself required an independent examination. The county engineer, Mr. Baines, initially addressed every technical question to Naylor. Naylor answered the first two, then pointed at Marian's plans and said, "The lady who drew those has been dead 30 years. The lady who found them is beside you." Eliza explained the expense symbols, tide dates, and hidden reserve. She did not pretend to understand pressure calculations beyond her training. Baines tested the spring, inspected the pump chamber, and confirmed the design could deliver several thousand gallons daily if the main and cistern were repaired. His report credited Marian by name and distinguished Eliza's accounting reconstruction from engineering conclusions. Proper limits made the report stronger. Vale attempted to purchase Baines's silence through a promise of hotel work. Baines disclosed the letter instead. The antagonist's pressure produced another witness. The deed described the north terrace, spring conduit, cistern easement, and a right of access across Vale's new land. It also named the bathhouse proprietor as operating custodian, not owner of the trust assets, but the person entitled and obliged to restore the system under trustee supervision. Eliza possessed standing because Vale had conveyed the baths to her without reserving that office. His attempt to exclude subterranean appurtenances had come too late. Proof still required provenance. Naylor identified Marian's signature, but was only a young attendant when it was made. The registry copy confirmed the will. The brass plate linked reserve accounts to the £200 share purchase. Thomas could testify to Vale's continuing maintenance orders and forged vouchers. Mrs. Fenwick had witnessed the documents emerge from the sealed conduit. The railway hotel's solicitor, learning that Vale might sell encumbered water, requested a public inquiry rather than risk fraud. Vale responded by seeking possession for unpaid rates. Eliza produced receipts. He alleged the trust papers were fabricated. She invited examination of paper, seals, registry entries, and bank dividend records. His established flaw was the precision with which he controlled money. The dividends had never vanished. Each year they had entered a dormant liability account at his own bank, where concealing them without theft required keeping the balance intact. The inquiry was held in March in Brackenmere's assembly room. Vale arrived composed, accompanied by Crozier and a solicitor. Eliza wore her repaired black dress and carried no dramatic box of riches, only ordered copies, receipts, plans, and the brass plate. Every bench was occupied. Some came because clean water concerned them. Others came for the fall of a banker. Eliza feared the second appetite. A crowd eager to condemn Vale could become as careless as the crowd that condemned her. Before proceedings began, she asked Henry Crewe to object to rumors about unrelated loans and private conduct. They would prove the wrong he had done, not build a monster out of gossip. Sir Matthew sat near the front, pale and uncomfortable. He had brought the original Wycliffe cash book only after the magistrate threatened a summons. Thomas's mother sat behind her son, with both hands clenched around a handkerchief. Crozier avoided the Fenwick's eyes. The chairman first considered boundaries. Vale's solicitor presented the later plan, excluding the North Passage. Eliza produced the older rate entry, the opening notice, and the conduit measurements. A surveyor appointed by the court confirmed that the Bathhouse foundations and inspection terrace lay within the historic parcel. The spring itself crossed Vale's land, but the registered easement in Marion's deed predated his purchases. His boundary stakes could not extinguish it. Then came custody. The vicar confirmed the probate copy. The bank's seal matched examples in archived correspondence. Mrs. Fenwick described the opening of the copper-lined box. Baines explained why airflow preserved it. The opposing solicitor pressed Kit on whether Eliza had entered the spring house earlier alone. She could not lift the stone with one good shoulder, Kit replied. Laughter rose, but the chairman silenced it. Kit then described each person present and where they stood. His precision did more than wit could have done. She began with the altered Wycliffe vouchers. Thomas testified that Vale directed him to add authorization after Eliza initialed blank payment schedules. A papermaker confirmed scraping under angled light. Sir Matthew's steward admitted the alleged missing sum had later been placed in a suspense account, not withdrawn by Eliza. Then she traced Marion's reserve. Each quarterly false admission corresponded to a maintenance inspection. The totals reached £203. £200 purchased shares, dividends entered Vale and Company's dormant liability account. When Vale's solicitor claimed coincidence, Eliza used Samuel's rule to calculate 40 years of dividends from the bank's own published rates. Her result differed from Vale's hidden balance by 7 shillings and 4pence, the exact fee recorded for replacing the spring valve in 1863. A murmur moved through the room. Vale made his fatal choice. No outsider could know of that valve. Eliza looked at him. Then you acknowledge the account and the apparatus it maintained. Crozier stared at the floor. The inquiry chairman ordered the bank books produced. Faced with contempt and possible criminal charges, Crozier admitted he had opened the sluice to force condemnation of the baths, acting on Vale's instruction. The survey stakes had marked the spring line for the hotel sale. The consequences were neither instant nor sentimental. Vale resigned from the bank partnership pending proceedings for conspiracy, fraud, and malicious damage. His assets were attached to secure restitution. Thomas received a formal caution for his part in copying the vouchers, but was not prosecuted after full testimony. He still had to rebuild the trust he had broken. Sir Matthew publicly withdrew the accusation and paid Eliza her wages and damages. She accepted the money, not his offer of reinstatement. Vale's public mask did not fall away in a single theatrical confession. He continued to insist that he had protected depositors from a useless charitable scheme. His solicitor argued that the apparatus had been obsolete even when concealed, and that diverting its assets toward profitable development served the town better. Baines answered with flow tests. Agnes Sayer answered with the price families paid carriers. Eliza answered with the trust language. Whether Vale considered himself practical did not alter an obligation he had accepted, concealed, and tried to sell. Crozier pleaded guilty to damaging the sluice and gave evidence regarding the forged notices. He served a short term of imprisonment and was ordered to contribute restitution from his wages. Eliza did not ask for greater punishment. He had frightened a child and nearly destroyed the building. But consequence was not the same as revenge. Vale, who planned the acts and profited from them, faced the heavier civil judgment and a separate criminal trial. Thomas's position proved harder. Several villagers wanted him appointed clerk at once because he had helped expose Vale. Mrs. Fenwick objected. Speaking after discovery does not erase copying before it. Eliza agreed. Thomas worked first for the parish surveyor, away from cash, and attended every hearing involving the Wycliffe tenants. He wrote individual apologies to those whose presence had been used to humiliate Eliza. Some forgave him, some did not. His mother found rooms above the cooper's shop with assistance from a tenant's collection, not charity from Eliza alone. By separating his survival from her personal approval, the village gave both of them room to judge honestly. Sir Matthew's apology was printed in the same county paper that had reported the accusation. Eliza required it to state that the vouchers were altered after she initialed them, and that no money had been taken by her. He wished to add that he had always doubted her guilt. She removed the sentence. His private doubts had not stopped a public wrong. When the notice appeared, Eliza expected relief. Instead, she felt tired. A reputation could be damaged in a minute and repaired only in the minds of people willing to read a correction months later. She folded the paper and placed it among the legal records, not beside Samuel's things. It was evidence, not comfort. The court recognized Marion Bell's trust, appointed the rector, a county engineer, and Eliza as new trustees, and confirmed the easements. The bathhouse remained Eliza's property, burdened and protected by its public duty. She could not sell the spring for private gain. Vale could not close access to it. Restoration took 14 months, not a miraculous fortnight. The first damages paid for a sound roof over the west rooms and repair of the breached sluice. Trust dividends funded the cistern and 2 standpipes. Men who had once repeated Vale's accusation hauled stone. Women who had carried harbor water advised where the taps must stand. Naylor trained younger attendants in the valves. Kit, fitted with a sturdy boot by the county surgeon, became Eliza's paid messenger and apprentice clerk. The trustees began with a budget of £312 released from accumulated dividends. Baines estimated that a complete restoration would consume nearly twice that. They therefore divided the work into safety, water, and income. Safety required roof trusses, 2 rebuilt chimneys, and shoring beneath the eastern gallery. Water required cleaning the spring conduit, lining the cistern, replacing 80 yards of cracked main, and protecting the outfall with a grate. Income required only 3 bathing rooms, a boiler, and the laundry, not the ornamental salon shown in the old prospectus. Eliza published the budget on the reception wall. Every Saturday she entered wages, materials, and changes. When dressed stone cost £4 more than expected, she delayed plasterwork rather than conceal the overrun. When a supplier offered a private discount in exchange for an exclusive coal contract, she recorded the proposal and invited competing bids. Transparency made decisions slower, but no single trustee could again turn a dormant line into private property. The physical labor altered the place by degrees. In April, carpenters removed roof timbers soft enough to crumble by hand. May brought lime mortar and the steady tapping of masons. In June, women scrubbed salt from tiles while the plumber tested each joint with spring water carried in barrels. A pressure failure beneath the yard forced them to lift newly laid paving, losing 12 days. No hidden fortune arrived to cover it. Eliza used part of her damages as a documented loan to the operating business, repayable only from future bath fees. Debate over the standpipes was sharper than any dispute about architecture. Baines preferred one large tap near the baths for ease of maintenance. Agnes and the washerwomen insisted on two because carrying full pails uphill from one point would exclude the oldest residents. They marked routes on Marion's plan and counted households. The second pipe added 31 pounds but halved the average carrying distance. The trustees approved it. Public benefit, Eliza wrote in the minutes, could not be measured only at the pump. When the first standpipe opened, no band played. Baines turned the valve, brown water ran for 4 minutes, and then the stream cleared. Mrs. Fenwick filled a white basin so everyone could see it. The doctor took samples. Only after his report did Eliza permit household use. Children who had gathered expecting a ceremony complained about the delay, then splashed one another until Agnes drove them off. The trust offered no promise that clean water alone would end illness. Drains still overflowed. Overcrowding remained. Some families continued using harbor barrels because habit was nearer than the new taps. Eliza asked the doctor and schoolmistress to hold practical talks at the washhouse. Attendance was poor until tea was provided. Improvement required persuasion, maintenance, and repetition, the same unromantic disciplines as bookkeeping. The bathhouse business nearly failed in its first autumn. Summer visitors paid well, but October's storms emptied the coast. Coal prices rose, and laundry receipts could not cover 6 wages. Eliza reduced opening days, took no salary for 5 weeks, and negotiated a shared coal delivery with the inn. She refused to spend protected water funds on commercial losses. By December, the books showed a narrow surplus. The following year, contracts to wash linen for 2 inns stabilized income. Not everyone revised an opinion. The butcher who had called her a thief admitted the water was useful, but said women made poor trustees because they remembered insults. Eliza continued paying him promptly for tallow and bought meat elsewhere. Restoration did not require unanimous affection. One rainy afternoon, Thomas presented his first quarterly account after returning. 2 pence were missing. He had searched for hours and looked ill with dread. Eliza found the error in a postage entry, corrected it in his presence, and had Kit countersign. "I thought you would dismiss me," Thomas said. "An error declared is not a fraud concealed." It was the lesson Vale had denied them both. Thomas copied it into the procedures book. No blank authorization, no altered entry without initials, no person solely responsible for receipt and reconciliation. Their safeguards were built from injury, but they did not have to reproduce its cruelty. The eastern wing remained closed behind a temporary wall while money accumulated. Eliza reopened 3 bathing rooms and the laundry first. Modest fees from visitors supported coal and wages. Village households certified by the trustees used the washhouse and clean water without charge. Thomas returned as assistant secretary after 6 months of supervised work and a public apology. Eliza did not pretend betrayal had never occurred. She gave him duties whose figures were checked by 2 people, the same safeguard every account deserved. In the closed wing, they preserved 1 damaged room exactly as they had found it. Visitors sometimes asked why peeling lime wash and a corroded pipe remained inside an otherwise orderly building. Eliza used the room to explain the difference between concealment and preservation. The broken pipe showed how the old system failed. The patched joint showed how it could be repaired. Copies of the bell entries showed how knowledge survived when official histories omitted its maker. Schoolchildren traced the tide route on a simplified plan, then watched the gable clock wind itself as the sea withdrew. No one called the room a museum yet, but it became a place where practical memory was taught. The small admission pennies went into a separate fund for apprentices' tools, audited each quarter by 2 villagers who had never before been invited to examine an institution's books. By the second summer, fever cases in the harbor quarter had fallen. The railway hotel was built farther south and contracted to pay the trust for surplus water, providing sustainable income without surrendering control. Copies of Marion's plans went to the Mechanics' Institute under her full name. Her proportional compass was displayed in the reception room, not as a curiosity belonging to a forgotten spinster, but as the tool of the engineer whose system still worked. Eliza kept Samuel's calculating rule beside it. One represented invention, the other, recognition. Neither had value while hidden. On the anniversary of her arrival, she climbed to the gable with Kit as the tide withdrew. Below them, children filled pitchers at the standpipe. Steam clouded the restored bath windows, and the ledger on her desk contained wages for 8 people, every line open to inspection. The repaired clock clicked forward as the float descended through clean water. For months, Eliza had believed that clearing her name would restore what Vale had taken. It did not return Samuel, the Wycliffe cottage, or the easy confidence with which she once trusted a signed page. What it gave her was less tidy and more durable. Work whose purpose could be seen in other people's lives, a home she had made habitable inch by inch, and authority founded not on another man's favor, but on evidence freely shared. The bell above the entrance rang as Mrs. Fenwick admitted the morning visitors. Eliza descended from the gable, pausing once to look over the gray sea, the sound roof, and the bright thread of spring water crossing the courtyard. Brackenmere had not been worthless. It had been made to appear so by men who expected neglect to erase obligation. The building stood because a succession of careful hands had refused to let that happen, and now her own hand had entered the account.